I now have the pleasure of introducing Tom Denenberg. You've already met him, but I'm going to introduce him again. Because in addition to serving as the museum's director, manager-in-chief, administrator plenipotentiary, I think that's how you say that, fundraiser and visionary, Tom somehow finds time to engage in curatorial research and scholarship. He earned a PhD in American and New England Studies from Boston University in Boston, Mass. After receiving his BA at Bates College. That's in Lewiston, Maine, for those of you like me who live in, the middle of New England. Mr. Denenberg came to Shelburne Museum in 2011 after serving first as chief curator and then deputy director at Portland Museum of Art from 2006 to 2012. While at Portland, Tom oversaw a dynamic exhibition program including major shows of Winslow Homer, who we have enjoyed spending time with this afternoon, the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, photography of rock musicians, and an exhibition series exploring the contemporary creative culture of Maine. At Shelburne, he has overseen the construction and opening of this beautiful new Pitot Center for Art and Education and has launched our institution's shift to year-round programming and exhibitions. Tom earlier served as curator of American Art at Renolda House Museum of American Art in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is affiliated with Wake Forest University, and as curator of American Decorative Arts at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art in Hartford, Connecticut. He's published numerous books and catalogues, including Wyeth Vertigo, Weatherbeaten, Winslow Homer in Maine, Winslow Homer and the Poetics of Place, Call of the Coast, Art Colonies of New England, Backstage Pass, Rock and Roll Photography, and Wallace Nutting and the Invention of Old America. Please join me in welcoming Tom back to the podium.
I could not be more pleased with this day, and I loved the broad spectrum of approaches that we've heard today, from Carol, who has brought a contextual look at the American Revolution seen through the eyes of a painter, to Ellery, who has asked us to think about the 19th century and temporality and speed and the way in which visual culture changed in the mid-century, and to Mark, who always teaches us that you have to look and look closely at these paintings because they reveal so much. And you heard it here. The question of the red-haired girl comes up all the time in Winslow Homer scholarship, and we now know she may have had blonde hair or was possibly a brunette. So I think we've already broken great ground, and my role here this afternoon is really to open up the aperture a little bit from these wonderful studies of these masterpieces, really marquee paintings in the collection, and talk a little bit about Elektra Havemeyer Web and what I'm calling the Canon of American Art as we see it at Shelburne Museum. And we're all going to go down the hill and see the paintings, confront them ourselves in the Webb Gallery. But I want to start really with just a maybe 6-month period in the history of Shelburne Museum, which not only has tremendous resonance on our institution and our collection, but also holds a mirror up to larger issues of visual culture and American art history in the 1950s and 60s. And I really want to start with a period between about middle of March, I'll even give you March 16th, 17th, when I found the first letter, 1960 through about October 1960, because I think there's a profound shift that happens, and we'll see how this story unrolls a little bit. Elektra Havemeyer Web, who of course was the daughter of the great collectors of French Impressionism, who had founded this institution in 1947 and really saw it come into its current state by about 1955. In 1960. As Ellery showed us in that slide, was preparing to open the Webb Gallery in 1960. And she was preparing to open it in a manner that was guaranteed to give the locals whiplash in Shelburne and Burlington and all her friends who had come to think of this as maybe Williamsburg North or something of that inkling. Because starting in October and through April, we have a number of these invoices that show that she was up to some fairly unusual behavior, kind of a late in life change of aesthetic and interest because she started buying paintings that were quite unlike the paintings she had been purchasing for the 3 years previously, and very, very unlike the paintings she had been purchasing since the 1930s and 40s, her interest in American folk art. Because in April of that year, April 18th, we have an invoice from the downtown gallery, Mrs. Edith Halpert for Mrs. Webb, and it enumerates Yasuo Kuniyoshi, Festivities Ended, 1947, Charles Sheeler, Sun Rock and Trees, 1949, Charles Sheeler, Composition Around Yellow No. 2, 1958, Georgia O'Keeffe, Poppies, 1950, Walt Kuhn, Bareback Rider. I don't have the invoice, but I know by that summer she had purchased the monumental William Zorak Madonna bronze that was here, and she had negotiated with her friend Maxim Karalik to purchase Soaring by Andrew Wyeth as well. So on hand at Shelburne for the opening of the Webb Gallery, the painting gallery, was a world-class collection of American modernism and contemporary art. Very, very different from what we were used to thinking about. We are now used to thinking about Shelburne, and people would have associated with this. In June of that year, however, she wrote a letter to Edith Halpert, and she said, well, I've changed my mind. Circumstances are a little different. And what happened is her husband, J. Watson Webb, passed away that spring. And I do have a feeling that Elektra Webb was perhaps in a somewhat of a minor key that spring, given the circumstances. And she decided to double down on her relationship with a world-class, national famous artist, and instead of installing the modern paintings, she said, I'll do that next year. What she wanted to do was celebrate Grandma Moses' 100th birthday. So in the brand new building, she opened it that year with a group of paintings that she owned, including this. It was a gift from Grandma Moses in 1957 to Elektra Havemeyer Web, Christmas time. A number of others that she already owned, and frankly, a truckload of them that came up from the Gallery Saint Etienne, which is, of course, Otto Collier's gallery and Grandma Moses's dealer in this time period. This should not surprise us. In 1960, all through the 1950s, we tend to think, received knowledge as this was the era where abstract expressionism reaches its apogee, and this sort of abstraction is really, the culmination of a march of American visual culture from the Armory Show through the 1950s. But if we look more closely at critical response and actual sort of exhibition history in the 1950s, we'll find that Grandma Moses outpulled abstract expressionism all through the decade. So it shouldn't come as any great surprise to us in that regard. She was such a popular favorite, and I think, in fact, it's quite understandable that our Elektra Webb on the right there chose to honor her friend's 100th birthday. They clearly shared interests, and searching for deep relationships. I don't tell you this story to set up a kind of a knee-jerk, the collection that could have been, because we'll talk about what happened to those paintings in a little while. And I don't set it up as a kind of art historical fish story, the collection that got away, the big ones that got away. Because I will tell you the Sheeler is at the Addison at Phillips Academy, and the George O'Keeffe is at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and the Zorak is at the Portland Museum of Art. I think I moved it 10 times before I ever knew it had ever been here in my old job. And I've tracked various other paintings around the country, the Walt Kuhn. This isn't a fish story of one that got away, but this is really setting us up for a conversation about the development of the canon of American painting in the 1950s and the shift in Elektra Havemeyer Webb's interests in defining or inventing folk art, which is really a modernist construction of the 1920s, 30s, 40s. This idea that you can create a category of naive painting is really one from from our era, and is one that Elektra Havemeyer Webb and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and Edith McGregor Halpert played such a key role in. But it's this turning away from that idea of folk art and this interest in what I would call the canonical American paintings. And here we have one of the great works in our collection, Edward Hicks' Penn's Treaty, with the Indians from 1840, which was a work that Elektra Webb purchased from Edith Halpert in downtown gallery in that time period. And one of the sort of remarkable things about Shelburne Museum, and you all know this, there are 150,000 objects here, and there's an archives, and there's a library, and Lord knows, we never throw anything away. So we have Elektra Havemeyer Webb's receipts, and we also have her library. We have her books. And this idea of sort of being Elektra Havemeyer Webb and going into our library and figuring out what she knew and when she knew it is really quite easy here. I didn't bring the bag up with me, but behind Carol, I brought a couple of books from our library that have her bookplate or her signature in it, and including all of her annotations in the margins, the marginalia, and circling artists that she liked. So it's pretty easy to understand the roadmap, if you will, the sort of trajectory she was on as she came to understand what we would think of as being the sort of accepted group of American artists who will be eventually on the walls of major museums like the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Metropolitan, because this was not uncontested terrain in the 1950s. This was new ground as museums in regional areas, regional cities, Greater Burlington and elsewhere, began to put together American collections. Fascinating to me, and thank you so much, Carol, for this morning. Elektra Webb thought this was the best painting in the collection, and this is why we asked Carol to come speak. And there is no dearth of photographs of Elektra Havemeyer Webb. She was a very well-documented figure as she put this museum together, and I think I found 5 separate photographs of her posing with the Copley just before the gallery opened that we will go see. So she was very, very proud of this painting, and we will come to sort of see this as really chapter 1, if you will, in the collection that she put together, and I do literally mean it as chapter 1, because if we look at the writings of James Thomas Flexner, Jimmy Flexner, who was the great sort of pop art historian of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. We have Elektra Webb's copies of Jimmy Flexner's book. Chapter 1 of the portrait book is, of course, Copley. So she literally sort of lifts her understanding of Copley out of Jimmy Flexner. I hope you will forgive my familiarity. James Flexner was a neighbor of my parents when I was a boy, and I was very, very tickled. This is a man that I knew as Santa Claus, because he had this great big white beard when I was a child, and to look at the dust jackets of Elektra Webb's book and see him as a very dashing young man in the late 1930s is really quite extraordinary. But literally, her kind of point of access to this owed as much, I think, to her reading of those books as it did to the very early Copley exhibitions that we saw earlier in the century. Also, if we think about the 1950s and our understanding of who is in and who is out of the canon of American art, John Heaton painting that we have here, Colonel Jacobus van Slyck from 1740. This one she purchased from Edith Halpert. I should point out that of this canonical collection, not the folk art, Elektra Webb purchased 16 paintings from Edith Halpert in the course of her very rapid acquisition of artwork between 1957 and the opening of the building in 1950. She did not know the artist. It was unattributed in that time period. My colleague Charlotte Emmons Moore, who's been working on our American Paintings catalog, did the attribution or performed the attribution this last year, working on the painting. But if you go back again to a second James Thomas Flexner book, First Flowers of Our Wilderness from 1947, the second chapter is about patroon portraits. So the fact that these early Dutch Hudson River Valley portraits, play such an important role in our collection, and there are 3 or 4 of these different very early 18th century portraits, all of that seem to be coming from somewhere between New York and up and down the Hudson. So there again, this is one of those paintings that as collectors begin to sort of sort out the bibliography of the time period and which paintings are being exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which are showing up in early Whitney catalogs of the very late 1930s, what shows up in the sort of popular press of James Flexner, this becomes almost a sort of a checklist, if you will, that you have to start your collection with one of these great portraits. The next sort of assembly within the group would of course be what she acquired as a Thomas Cole. We now recognize this as a Henry Cheever Pratt painting because there's more scholarship, but she bought it as a Thomas Cole, Moses on the Mount, 1828, and it's part of a group of probably 10 or 12 paintings that all are either classicizing or mythologizing or are paintings that add what I keep calling bones to the ground in the early Republic. And if you think back to Carroll's final comments about the Revolution and the Philbrick book, and we tend to forget that this country was forged in profound violence during the Revolution, and we fought another war with the British, and we were in constant economic ups and downs. And not only was the future of the country up for grabs in the early 19th century, but American culture was up for grabs. And so our interests in classicizing figures in the landscape, Federal and Greek Revival buildings, literally these sort of talismans of cultures with great permanence from antiquity, with which we dot the New England landscape in this time period, but that plays such an important role in the visual culture as well. I don't need to, I think, parse the issue of the Israelites coming into the Catskills here, but it is all about, it is all about sort of imbuing a sense of purpose and timelessness and history and mission into this very young nation. And remember that this country is, one generation old at this point. This is the parents' generation that actually founded it. So having a little bit of gravitas, if you will, is all important in the paintings of the early Republic. Not to say that we want to shy away entirely from talking about portraits like Erastus Salisbury Field. This is either Clarissa or Louisa Galland Cook, and Carol, you may recognize her because she bears a family resemblance to a painting that you used to have purview over, I believe. This is the great Erastus Salisbury Field at the Museum of Fine Arts. We do know that Field painted a number of individual portraits from the Cook and Galland and Moore families in about 1838 or 1839. And in this case, we want to sort of problematize, I think, that question of folk art for a minute and rough up the edges a little bit. Because as I mentioned before, this is a modernist construction. This was a category, a sort of art historical category. It was a designation principally put together by dealers in this time period for trying to sort of come up with this sort of naive, distinctly American rubric of portraiture. And what I so loved about Carol's presentation before was this notion that you can read a political agenda into portraiture, and some people want to look like loyalists, and some people want to look like revolutionaries in that era. And that continues on into the early 19th century. And one of the wonderful exhibitions of recent years was organized by one of Shelburne Museum's own staff members, Jackie Oak, over at the Cooperstown, the Fenimore Museum last year, where she looked at the work of William Matthew Pryor, who we would also characterize as one of these folk painters or plain painters. And Jackie pointed out that there are, in fact, 3 or 4 different categories of Pryor portraits that you could purchase in the 1840s. Based on if you had $7 or $15 or $21. The more money you had in your pocket, and the more time you had to negotiate with your portraitist, and the more modeling you got in your cheek as you went forward. And so in this case, rather than continue the sort of the hard distinctions between the folk collections at Shelburne Museum and the canonical collections, I do want to sort of toss them together, because here was one of the paintings that came in the 1950s, and again, in its era, it perfectly served the needs of its culture and community where it was painted in upstate New York, and this was exactly the portrait that this family wanted to have, and she was very well-to-do. And so all the sort of symbolism of the painting behind the sort of view of a seaport behind her, all of this played a very important role. And Erastus Salisbury Field certainly did not hang out a shingle saying he was a folk painter or a folk artist. One of the most important, I think, pendants or pair of portraits that we have is, in fact, the William Matthew Prior portraits of William and Nancy Lawson from 1843. These also came from Maxim Karalik. If I did not say it before, I hope you'll forgive my emphasizing. In this collection, there were 117 paintings that she purchased from Maxim Karalik in 1957 and 1958. The Karalik collection, those of you who are familiar with the Museum of Fine Art Boston will understand, is really fair to say, the core of the American collections there. Maxim Karalik is a wonderful figure unto himself. If we've learned today that Winslow Homer is worthy of a documentary, maybe even a reality TV show, Maxim Karalik may even be a better candidate. He was a Russian opera singer who came to America, married a member of the codfish aristocracy, the sort of elite Boston Brahmins. He was born in 1893 and died in 1963, and single-handedly was responsible for really honing or creating the lens through which Boston came to understand American art history. His gift in 1939 of the first of 3 collections of American paintings, first 18th century arts, second 19th century paintings, and the third, the 19th century watercolors, eventually led to his designation in 1958 as honorary curator of American art at the Museum of Fine Arts. And what is so important to our story is the 4th collection that he put together came to Shelburne Museum, those 117 paintings that he sold to Elektra Webb. There's also a story that I've heard about town, and I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, that he traveled to Shelburne in the summer of 1960 after Watson Webb passed away to propose marriage to Elektra Havemeyer Web. And so I think this was a figure who kind of had an eye for a situation, for an opportunity, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. I don't know if you ever came across that, but in your days. But again, extremely important. We can count on one hand the number of portraits of African Americans. Very, very rare in this particular circumstance that William Matthew Prior actually signs his name, and that was a very, very brave thing to be doing in the 1840s. The Lawsons themselves, so many of you are familiar with these paintings. Mr. Lawson ran a second-hand clothing business that catered to the maritime trades, a kind of ship's chandlery for African Americans. One of the only places you'll find an African American middle class in the world, period, in this time period, is in coastal New England. So really remarkable paintings with a number of biographical sort of connections between the artist and the sitters. Nancy Lawson on the left came from Maine, as did William Matthew Prior. They both followed the same preacher. They were Millerites. They understood that the world was going to come to the end in March of 1843. And so it's a fairly extraordinary act for them to sit for their portraits in that final year before they were going to be called home, as a way of sort of fixing their visage on this earth. I'm always struck that the Millerites did have to change their theology a little bit. The day after March, I've forgotten the exact date, say it's the 15th of 1843, in their theology is known as the Great Disappointment, because they were not, in fact, called to heaven into a better place. But again, for our purposes, Karalik clearly understood that these were paintings of a remarkable interest and quality and rarity when he sold them to Elektra Webb. These and about 25 or 30 other paintings, I kept a little separate list because when I first was trying to sort out the Webb Karalik collection, I wanted to make sure these weren't just the B team that were left over from the MFA paintings. But I do dare say that the MFA would have been happy to have these paintings with the Karalik, the original Karalik collection as they went to Boston. Number of other wonderful kind of odd coincidences. in the course of reviewing the paintings that we installed that you'll see down the hill in Webb Gallery. Worthington Ridge. This has been published by a couple of different titles, Mount Storm Park or A View of Cincinnati. It's a very sweet little painting. It's not so terribly big. It's looking through this deer park. I keep thinking of it as a very English painting in that regard, at this burgeoning industrial city of Cincinnati in the background there. Cincinnati in the 1840s was a center of publishing. It was obviously on the river and a sort of a jumping off point to the West, and the West is about to be so important in the mythology and the culture of American history. I apologize that I did not write down Worthington Ridge's birth date when I put this together, but in fact, I was going to say, thank you very much, he's something like 23 years old when he paints this. And what's so remarkable, and one of these sort of odd little coincidences, is throughout the landscape paintings that she purchases, sort of making up this next category, and again following the early textbook of Richardson and Larkin, Oliver Larkin, and these early American art textbooks, she buys very early works in the artist's oeuvre. So Worthington Ridge at age 23, Cropsey at age 19 or 20. I don't think she knew she was doing that, but it does have a kind of a wonderful, almost sort of adolescent or raw feeling to the landscape paintings. They're very unlike what we've come to expect of the mature work of these artists. And so to Jim, your question earlier, how did Copley just sort of appear out of the blue? How did Heed appear out of the blue? How did these individuals all of a sudden, sort of show up as fully formed artists? 23-year-old artist here, and it does sort of go back to that recent, assertion by Malcolm Gladwell that if you put 10,000 hours into anything, you will be a master at it. And so clearly, this was someone who worked very hard through his young teenage years. Now, that city in the background, and there's smokestacks, and there's all sorts of activity going on, and I think you can make out perhaps the traces of the sort of riverboat commerce as well. That should really be a portend of what's going to come in the next painting or two, because this really is about the transition from the sort of mythology of the wilderness here, this deer park, into the reality of what we're going to see in the second half of the 19th century in America, and really the conditions of modernity in this country. And what's so phenomenal to me in this collection is the Charles Day's The Death Struggle, also came from the Kerelic collection in 1845. When I first was thinking about this painting, I completely missed on the fact that it was that early, 1845. And if you think about the sort of the idea of the West in American culture, and the sort of the organizing myth of the frontier, I just have never placed it as early as 1845. In this case, we have the trapper who has come into contact with Native Americans. They are clearly in for kind of a rough landing. And the sort of the circles of violence in this painting, also when you get down to the gallery, do give it close regard. Obviously, we have a witness who will fill out the report, the incident report, once this is all over. But the trapper in the wonderful red scarlet hunting shirt, Native American, one dirk, one dagger, second dagger. Even the beaver is getting in on the action, biting the Indian here, and he is caught in the trap. But it is a profoundly unsettling painting that kind of raises the hair on the back of your neck when you confront it. And as many of you know, and comes as no great surprise to those of you who are unfamiliar with Days, we do know that he ended his days in Bloomingdale Asylum in New York City in, I believe, 1968. So I agree with Mark. It does behoove us to be very cautious and creep up on psychobiography when looking at paintings, but I'm very, very comfortable asserting that Charles Days was at least agitated as early as 1845 when he paints this, and it is one of these magnificent paintings. Also, just a little kind of hint that we saw back in that painting of Cincinnati, I think comes to full fruition in the work of James Bard, John and James Bard, two brothers who are the sons of an English ship portraitists who come to America and make their living producing a plethora of these paintings, which are really portraits of vessels for ship owners. This was the kind of work that you would commission of your steamship in the 1850s, early 1860s, to hang on the wall of your office or your counting room. It comes as no surprise that Elektra Webb would be interested in steamships. In the winter of 1955, as you all know, she compelled the Ticonderoga to cross 3 miles of pasture land and find its home in the basin right just a little bit to the west of us here. So it shouldn't surprise us that she eventually came to purchase 7 Bard Brothers paintings, including the one that you will see that Ellery referenced earlier. Wonderful paintings that are really all about the sort of the promise of commerce and industry in America. These glowing white ships as they move resolutely upstream, either on the eve of the Civil War or during the Great Conflict itself. And Ellery's comments about Heed sort of skipping out on the war. So many of these painters either physically took a powder and left the country for studies abroad, or in their work make no mention of the great bloodletting that is going on. And we should remember that we're on the eve here of the country coming apart. And the Bard brothers paint these paintings throughout the early part of that conflict. And if you even think of the lanes, and we'll come to Fitzhenry Lane in a moment in my comments, we get implications of the conflict in the work of the Lanes, but we really don't get, the sort of the blood and gore of what is going on on the battlefield. The one thing that I do sort of speculate when you look at these paintings, there is always that moody, dark shore back in the distance. So there's some darkness in these works that I don't think is just principally used for the formality of making these vessels glow as they move upstream in the course of the war. Bierstadt. Took me a little while to kind of get my head around the burning ship, 1869. I, of course, wanted to see one of those great Western paintings. But there are something like 24 or 28 different paintings of vessels. So clearly this was a major theme in her collecting, and putting the American art collection in 1957 to 1960. This depicts a Confederate commerce raider that has captured or run a Union ship up onto the shoals, onto the shore, and is in the course of burning it. Again, a Keralik painting. Again, a very, very dramatic painting. And I think we see a number of these works, like the Days, like the Bierstadt, and like several others, which have a tremendous sort of potential for emotional impact on the viewer. They aren't the sort of great Western paintings that provoke that sort of sense of the sublime or the systolic response that you get, that sense you're about to fall over, which of course was the artist's original intent. These are modernist paintings. These are paintings that a modernist, Elektra Webb, is purchasing for this kind of sucker punch, if you will, that they give you right between the eyes. And throughout the course of the collection, I think you'll see that time and time again. I'll try to explain that one more time. That may have been a little obtuse, but in the mid-19th century, of course, there's so much effort placed at provoking that sense of the sublime in landscape painting. Niagara Falls, you're going to lean over the edge, and Bierstadt is such a master of that, and Church and all these others. When Elektra Webb went to purchase a Bierstadt, she purchased something that was really quite shocking and kind of snaps your head around. It isn't the beautiful landscape painting. It is a scene of violence at night. And I think you will see that time and time again throughout the collection. So when we go down the hill, do pay close attention to that theme as it runs through. I think she likes very coded paintings. And I do think that she was a very active participant in purchasing these paintings, because as we sort of weave our way through her bibliography, as we have it in the library, we understand. Eastman Johnson, Family Cares, 1873. The sort of Johnsons that were popular in the 1940s and early 1950s tended to be his sketches. The early Johnson exhibitions, as he was first sort of rehabilitated and put on view, Brooklyn Museum in New York, tended to be unfinished paintings or paintings that sort of were more congruent with our modernist notion of action painting. And the more finished paintings don't get recognition for quite some time until really Patricia Hills is working on them in the late 1960s, early 1970s in her shows at the Whitney. This is a sort of an unusual Johnson. If you look very closely, and you'll see that there's some pretty shocking activity in this painting. First and foremost, there is a little African-American doll being lynched on that chair. You then have all of these broken dolls, and you have this little girl who is in the sort of effort or in the sort of business of fixing all of her dolls. So just as Mark pointed out, we want to really spend a lot of attention thinking about the intention, pay a lot of attention to the intention of the artist in the late 1860s and 1870s as they use these images of children for symbols of rebirth after the Civil War, after the great conflict. It's also extremely telling to notice the political commentary in this as well. Family cares. Here we have a nation torn asunder, all of these little broken dolls, and we have this girl sort of symbolically charged with the hopes and the future of the nation, of putting the family back together. Family cares, mending all the dolls. Meanwhile, we have this tremendous burden and legacy of slavery and Reconstruction that's being played out with this awful little lynching going on. So on one hand, we approach this in a very, sort of open and naive way of, what a sweet little picture of a girl after the Civil War. But there are some very, very unsettling undertones to Eastman Johnson's painting. I am certainly not going to even attempt to go near it because I think Mark's exegesis of this painting was just brilliant, and I love it. But again, it's just one of these sort of scenes of what we see, this ruralizing past in the 1870s, which is so important to see as being played out in an era where we are turning into an increasingly urban, increasingly heterogeneous, and increasingly industrial nation. So these sort of symbols of a ruralizing sort of common mythology for America are hugely important. Charles Callistus Burley, Lady with a Peacock Fan, 1882. Burley was from Florence, Massachusetts. He traveled to Germany. He exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. This is, in fact, studied under Frank Duveneck in Germany. This is, in fact, a portrait of his wife, and it's a loving painting. When you get down to the gallery, I do suggest you give it close regard. We don't hear much about Burley. He died fairly young, but this is one of those really remarkable works that again came from Maxim Karalik into the collection at this institution. John Frederick Pitot's Ordinary Objects in the Artist's Creative Mind. Here again, I'm quite certain that Elektra Webb was thinking about ways of animating the very landscape of her museum when she was buying trompe-l'oeil paintings. There are a number of wonderful still life or trompe-l'oeil paintings in the collection. We have the Pitot up right now. All of you know that there was a great deal of scholarly confusion, mostly fueled by the market between Pitot and Harnett and sometimes Haberle. Dealers would take a Pitot and change the signature and sell it as a Harnett because that Harnett was rehabilitated a little earlier in the Canon of American painting. I'm really very fond of this painting because not only does Pitot include a work by Harnett on his canvas, but he also gives us a Homer as well. So he's sort of painting himself into the canon of American art in that time period and helping to engender that confusion between the sort of holy trinity of trompe-l'oeil painters, Harnett, Haberle, and Pitot in this time period. Enoch Wood Perry, the Pemigewasset Coach from 1899. Again, one of these paintings that has resonance for a number of different reasons. 1899, of course, this is a extraordinarily nostalgic view. In 1899, people are not traveling in Concord coaches much in New England at all. They're on trains, they're on streetcars. This is a painting that came to Shelburne Museum via the old print shop. There are about 33 paintings that came from Harry Shaw Norman at the old print shop, so it's the second largest dealer into the collection in this time period. Also so interesting to me, as you tab through Elektra Webb's books in our library, there's at least one catalog given to Elektra Webb by Harry Shaw Newman of an early exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where they are corresponding about individual paintings in the Whitney show. And so it's this wonderful sort of survey about, or it's a survey of their conversation about what should be in a collection of American painting. He also sent her a catalog from an early exhibition of American art at the Corcoran. And of course, the Corcoran is an institution which is just now passing into its next life as part of the National Gallery of Art and George Washington University. So the fact that the dealer is providing Elektra Webb with the scholarly materials of the day to begin to make the selections and frame the sort of texture of the collection, I think is the kind of thing you would see today, in fact. This is not just sort of naive reliance on the part of Elektra Webb on the taste of Edith Halpert or Maxim Karalik or Harry Shaw Newman at the old print shop. Also a wonderful backstory to this painting. Obviously one of the founding moments, or the sort of impetus for the creation of Shelburne Museum, was a need on the part of Elektra Webb to find a home for the carriage collection that the family had inherited. So right from the very earliest Innocenti and Werbel landscape designs for Shelburne Museum, we see these wonderfully fanciful horseshoe barns and big barns to house the family carriages. So the horse-drawn vehicles are really part of the story of Genesis of Shelburne Museum, and we have such an important collection. So here again, the fact that she buys this great salon-scale painting of a Concord coach, a very recognizable vehicle from 1899, this nostalgic scene that you see here. I'm also very fond, though, of the fact that Harry Shaw Newman, in fact, really acted as the broker for this painting, and the owner, who sold it through Newman to Elektra Webb, was the painter Eric Sloane. And those of you who can conjure up in your mind's eye, an image of Eric Sloane painting of the New England scene of the 1940s and 50s, the covered bridge, the barn, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, I think you'll understand that this is very congruent with his vision of the past, as well as hers. Now I want to get into what happens between that 1899 moment and all of those sources, and where we're going to head for the last slide before we have our panel discussion and before we move down the hill. Because in the fall of 1960, as I mentioned, Elektra Havemeyer Web planned to open the museum with a bang with these modernist paintings. In the fall of 1960, Elektra Webb suffers a medical reverse. She has a stroke and she passes away. What we have is a collection that becomes somewhat orphaned. Shortly after she took ill, her secretary went to tidy up her desk, to clean up her desk, and came across a leather box. And within the leather box was a list, and the list is entitled Moderns I Like. And so not only do we know the paintings that were here, Poppies, the O'Keeffe, the Kuniyoshis, the great Zorak sculpture, the Sheelers that were here, but we also have this very suggestive list in her handwritings: Albright, Benton, Innes, Akins, Graves, Levine, R. Marsh, then it says Sculpture, Hoffman, and Manship. If you take John Bauer's New Art in America from 1957, and we have Elektra Webb's copy of John Bauer's book, and this is one of these wonderful pop surveys of painting in the 1950s, and it has essays by Bauer and James Thrall Sobey and Lloyd Goodrich and the other sort of luminaries, these figures who were so important to constructing the framework of our understanding of American painting in the 1950s. If you look at the title page to her copy of Bauer's book, she also circles Levine, Benton, Kuniyoshi, Albright again. So we have this understanding of what about 15 paintings were either in the pipeline or coming to Shelburne Museum in this time period. Moderns I like, is what she said. And if you look at them all and then you overlay them onto the exhibition program of the Museum of Modern Art from 1944 until 1948, specifically the catalog American Realism and Superrealism, which sort of helped define a category that we've sort of lost track of, which we call magical realism. In the 1940s, these were called magical realists. You look at these paintings as a whole, and you understand that Elektra Webb was on the precipice of doing something really quite extraordinary at Shelburne Museum in putting a collection together, because that really is the sort of collection that rivaled what was going on at MoMA in the 1940s. And we can put it all sort of back together in that context. I did mention, and we all talked a great deal about this painting last year when we organized the exhibition Vertigo, that she had already negotiated for the purchase of Soaring in the late spring of 1960. I very quickly point out that the sketch, one of the first sketches for Soaring, of that turkey buzzard was the last plate in that American Realism and Magical Realism from MoMA. It was where Andrew Warhol sort of debuted the idea of this painting. And I also point out, and apologies, Carol, that the MFA sort of, I guess it was the registrar of the MFA, dragged his heels throughout the summer of 1960. So the painting didn't get to Shelburne Museum until the fall of 1960. And for some reason, the sketches got left in Boston. I still want to talk to Boston about that. And so this painting was purchased but didn't come here until the fall of 1960 after she passed away. And that was probably fortuitous for us because what happened is Watson Jr., her son, in the fall and winter of 1960, returned the rest of the modern paintings to the galleries. So the collection of moderns I like, the ones that actually had been purchased and were here, stayed here, the Zorak, and that was later deaccessioned in the 1980s. The Wyeth, because Wyeth continued to become of interest throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and was somewhat congruent with the idea of an Americana museum as Shelburne evolved in that time period. But as I mentioned earlier, the O'Keeffe is on the wall at the Milwaukee Art Museum. It's a wonderful painting, monumental painting. Phillips Academy students enjoy the Sheeler. The Kuniyoshi went to a museum in Japan. The Kuhn is in a public collection. And all of these others, moderns I like, that she intended to purchase never happened. But what it all does is lead us to a very rich understanding of the canon of American painting as it evolved in the late 1950s. And because Shelburne's collection was cast in amber, if you will, at the moment that she died, and it really didn't change much thereafter. We didn't have an American painting curator. We did a little bit of work here and there, and obviously paintings were added to the collection by gift and purchase over the years, but it wasn't what I would call a curated collection in an intentional way. What we have is really an archive of 1950s understanding of American painting. It's kind of a moment in time which so many other museums enjoyed as well, but then added other individuals to, and as the canon expanded, if you will. And so Shelburne Museum becomes kind of a Rosetta Stone-like moment for understanding American art and our interest in American art in the 20th century. And I would argue that a lot of it comes back to this little note that Elektra Webb's secretary found in her desk at her death, moderns I like, and the way that that sort of unfurls the story of the painting collection is something that we can take up in conversation with my favorite colleagues who are here today, as well as in the gallery down the hill as we discuss the collection in the flesh.